"You need to hear the truth about that man," said Elias Horne, his jaw set hard as stone, his eyes fixed on Dorothy Fletcher like he was delivering a verdict rather than a warning. "The man who gave you that horse, Bernard Ralston, has a price on his head in 3 counties. He is wanted for robbery, for eluding federal marshals, and the last man who trusted him ended up face down in a dry creek bed outside of Abilene." Dorothy stood in the doorway of her modest homestead, one hand gripping the doorframe, the other pressed flat against her chest. Behind her she could hear her children, 8-year-old Clara and 6-year-old Thomas, squabbling over something in the kitchen, utterly unaware that the ground beneath their mother's feet had just cracked open. "You are lying," she said, but the words came out hollowed and thin, like they didn't quite believe themselves. "I am not lying," Horne said. He was a big man, broad-shouldered, rancher-built, with a sun-weathered face and pale blue eyes that rarely flinched. "I was there when he rode into this county 3 weeks ago. I saw his face on the notice that came through the marshal's office in Carver Creek. Bernard Ralston, 5'11", dark hair, scar above the left brow, rides a gray Appaloosa, the same gray Appaloosa that is currently standing in your paddock." Dorothy's gaze shifted involuntarily toward the paddock at the edge of her property, where the big dappled horse stood with his elegant neck bent to the water trough. She remembered the morning Bernard had led that animal through her gate. She remembered the children running out to touch him, Clara laughing, Thomas reaching up with both arms like the horse was the most magnificent creature God had ever assembled. She remembered Bernard standing back, watching them with something in his expression that she had not been able to name then and could not name now. She turned back to Horne. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you are a widow alone on this land with 2 children, and that man has been coming around here," Horne said, and there was something else layered beneath the warning in his voice, something she could not quite locate. "Because whatever story he has told you, whatever he has made you feel, you need to know who he really is before it is too late." Dorothy said nothing. She let the silence stretch between them like a rope pulled tight. And in that silence, she replayed it all from the beginning. It had started 6 weeks before Elias Horne arrived on her porch with his truth and his pale blue eyes, back in the dry golden end of September in the year 1882, in the wide flat basin country of the Texas Panhandle, where the wind came hard off the plains and the sky went on forever in every direction. Dorothy Fletcher had been a widow for 11 months by then. Her husband, Robert Fletcher, had died the previous October from a fever that started in his lungs and finished the rest of him in less than a fortnight. He had been a good man, steady, hardworking, not particularly exciting but steady, and steadiness counted for a great deal when you were trying to hold a homestead together in a place where everything conspired to take it from you. When Robert died, he left Dorothy with 40 acres of dry land, a 2-room house, a small vegetable garden that the rabbits were steadily defeating, 2 children, a mule named Clarence, and a debt of $60 owed to the general store in Carver Creek. $60 might as well have been $600. Dorothy had no family within a week's ride. Robert's brother had written twice to suggest she sell the land and move to his family in Missouri, but the land was all she had, and she was not prepared to surrender it. She had taken in mending from the families in town and sold eggs from her 4 remaining hens, and bartered with neighboring farm wives, and done everything she could think of to keep the seams of her life from splitting entirely open. By the end of September 1882, Clarence the mule was limping badly on his left foreleg, and Dorothy had no means to fix it and no money to hire anyone to help her with the harvest of the small cornfield she'd managed to plant in the spring. Without being able to work the field, the corn would stand and rot on the stalks, and without the corn she had nothing to sell, and without anything to sell, she could not pay the debt at the general store, and without paying the debt, she could not get credit for supplies through the winter, and without supplies through the winter, she and her children would face a very dark 3 months. She was standing in the field, looking at the corn and looking at Clarence and doing the arithmetic in her head, and finding that it came out wrong every single time when she heard the sound of a rider coming up the road. She looked up. He was coming from the west, which meant he'd come across the open country rather than up the main track from Carver Creek, and that alone was unusual. Most travelers kept to the roads. The horse he was riding was a gray Appaloosa of exceptional quality, the kind of animal that cost more than most men in this part of Texas made in a year, and the man himself sat it with the easy, unconscious grace of someone who had spent a very large portion of his life in a saddle. He pulled up at the edge of her field when he saw her standing there. He touched the brim of his hat. "Ma'am," he said. Dorothy looked at him. He was perhaps 32 or 33 years old, lean in the manner of men who moved constantly rather than men who were underfed, with dark hair that was slightly too long and a face that would have been handsome if it weren't for the quality of alertness in it, a watchfulness that never fully let go, like a man who had learned to read the sounds behind sounds and the meanings behind meanings. There was a scar above his left eyebrow, a thin, pale crescent, old enough to be well healed. "You need something?" Dorothy asked, because courtesy only went so far when you were tired and worried and standing in a field that represented the entirety of your hope. "Water if you can spare it," he said. "For the horse mostly. I've been riding since morning." Dorothy looked at the Appaloosa. The animal was thirsty, that was plain enough. She was not in the habit of refusing water to a horse, whatever she might think about the rider. "Trough is behind the house," she said. He nodded and rode around, and Dorothy followed at a distance, watching him. He dismounted with that same easy economy of movement, and led the horse to the trough, and stood back while the animal drank. And he looked out across the land with those watchful dark eyes, and Dorothy had the unsettling sense that he was cataloging everything he saw. "Your mule is favoring the left leg," he said without turning around. "I noticed," Dorothy said. "Stone bruised by the look of it. If you've got a knife and some time, I can dig it out. He should be right in a day or two after." Dorothy paused. "You know mule care." "I know horse care," he said. "Mules are not so different." She studied him. There was nothing overtly threatening about him, but there was nothing entirely comfortable about him either. He was the kind of man who created a quality of attention in a room or in a yard simply by being present, and Dorothy was not sure whether that was a virtue or a danger. "Who are you?" she asked. He looked at her then for the first time with his full attention, and the quality of his gaze was direct and undeflected and slightly startling. "Bernard Ralston," he said. "Where are you from?" A pause, brief, but she caught it. "Originally from east of here," he said. "I move around." "What do you do?" Another one of those pauses. "Various things," he said. Then, with what might have been a faint edge of dry humor, "Currently, I am offering to fix your mule." Dorothy decided to let him. His hands were sure and quick with Clarence, and the mule, who trusted almost nobody on general principle, stood without fussing while Bernard worked the bruised hoof with a small folding knife he carried in his coat pocket. Within 20 minutes, Clarence was standing on all four legs without any visible discomfort, and Dorothy was standing with her arms crossed, watching, feeling something shift slightly in her chest that she immediately moved to tamp down. "Clara, Thomas," she called. The children appeared from inside the house like a pair of birds flushing from tall grass, Clara first, her brown hair escaping its braid, and then Thomas right behind her, sock feet and all. "Come say thank you to Mr. Ralston," Dorothy said. "He fixed Clarence's hoof." Clara said thank you with perfect gravity. Thomas went straight to the horse instead, which Dorothy thought probably told you everything you needed to know about Thomas. "Can I touch him?" Thomas asked. Bernard looked at the child for a long moment. Something happened in his expression that Dorothy could not quite interpret, a softening, or something adjacent to softening, something careful and slightly unguarded. "Yes," he said. "Put your hand out flat first. Let him smell you." Thomas did as he was told, and the Appaloosa dropped his big gray head and breathed on the boy's palm, and Thomas laughed. A high, clear, delighted sound, and Dorothy felt her chest do something complicated that she absolutely refused to examine. Bernard stayed for supper. She told herself it was because he had fixed the mule and she owed him something, and because the rule of hospitality in this part of the country was as binding as law. She told herself it had nothing to do with the way he'd spoken to Thomas about the horse, or the way he'd looked at Clara when she'd launched into a detailed account of a book she was reading, with the expression of a man who was genuinely interested in what a small girl thought about the world. At the table, the conversation was careful on both sides. He asked about the farm. She told him the honest version, the corn harvest, the debt, the difficulty of the season. She was not certain why she told him the honest version rather than a more composed one, except that he asked questions in a way that made evasion feel faintly silly. He did not offer advice or solutions. He listened. After supper, when the children were in bed, he sat on the porch steps while she washed the dishes, and they talked through the window, which was an arrangement that was both proper and odd, and Dorothy found herself smiling at the oddness of it without quite meaning to. He left before dark. He said he needed to make some distance that night. He thanked her for the meal. He did not say whether he was passing through or whether she would see him again, and she did not ask. She saw him again 4 days later. He came back with a saddle of tools she hadn't asked for and spent a morning fixing the broken hinge on her barn door and reinforcing the fence posts along the south side of the property, which had been leaning badly since the spring storms. He worked without fanfare and without commentary, and Dorothy watched him from the kitchen window while she worked and told herself she was not watching him. She was merely noticing whether the fence posts were being properly set, which was a reasonable and purely practical thing to do. Thomas followed him like a small, determined shadow the entire morning, handing him things and asking questions with the relentless, cheerful thoroughness of a 6-year-old who has found something interesting. Bernard answered every question, not in the distracted, slightly absent way that adults sometimes answered children's questions, but with full attention, as though the questions genuinely interested him. "What's that for?" asked Thomas. "It keeps the post from shifting when the ground gets wet," Bernard said. "Why does the ground move?" Thomas asked. "Because when soil absorbs water it expands, and when it dries it contracts," Bernard said. "Think of it like breathing. The earth breathes very slowly." Thomas considered this with the profound seriousness he brought to all new information. Then he said, "Does it dream?" Bernard looked at him for a moment. Then he said, "I expect it does." Dorothy turned away from the window because she could feel something accumulating in her chest that was not safe to let accumulate, and she had no room for unsafe things. She was a widow with 2 children and $60 of debt and 40 acres of dry land and a limping mule, or a mule that had been limping until 4 days ago. And she was not in any position to let herself feel things that would only complicate a situation that was already plenty complicated. He came back a 3rd time a week after that, and then a 4th time 4 days after that, and by the 5th visit, which was a Tuesday in mid-October, Dorothy had stopped pretending that she wasn't expecting him. On the 5th visit, he brought a sack of dried beans and a small bag of cornmeal, and when she started to object, because she was proud and because accepting charity felt like an admission of something she wasn't ready to admit, he said, simply, "I ate at your table 3 times. It is not a gift, it's a debt." She let it go. She was learning that Bernard Ralston had a particular skill for making things that should have been awkward feel simply factual. That afternoon, while Clara read on the porch and Thomas napped, a circumstance that Thomas considered a personal affront and that Dorothy treasured with a devotion bordering on the sacred, Dorothy and Bernard sat at the kitchen table with cups of coffee, and she asked him again where he was from. "I grew up in Missouri," he said, "near Kansas City." "Do you have family there?" "I had a mother. She died when I was 17, a pause, and a brother." The way he said brother, the slight shift in his voice, a tightening like a hand closing over something, told her there was a story there. She did not push. "And after your mother died?" she asked. He looked at his coffee cup. "I made a series of decisions," he said, "that I have been living with since." Dorothy looked at him steadily. "That is true of most people," she said. "Yes," he said, "but not all decisions are created equal." The silence that fell between them after that was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that exists between people who have decided to trust each other carefully, by degrees, with the same deliberateness that you'd approach a fire close enough for warmth, with enough awareness of the heat to keep yourself from being burned. She did not know what his decisions had been. She did not know what he was carrying. But she knew, with the certainty of a woman who had survived 11 months alone in a hard country on nothing but practical intelligence and sheer will, that Bernard Ralston was not a simple man, and that whatever he was not telling her was significant. She also knew, sitting at her kitchen table in the dry October afternoon with her children sleeping and reading in the next room, that she was in serious danger of doing something she had promised herself she would not do. She was in danger of falling in love with him. She pushed back from the table and refilled both their coffee cups, and they talked about the harvest, and about whether it would frost before November, and about Clara's reading and Thomas's interest in horses. And she kept all of it perfectly controlled and sensible and practical. And when he left that evening, she stood in the doorway and watched him ride the gray Appaloosa down the road toward the horizon, and she told herself very firmly that she was not watching for the beauty of it. She was watching to make sure he was gone. The lie lasted about 40 seconds. He came again the following week, and this time he stayed for 2 days, sleeping in the barn, which was proper, and helping her bring in the remainder of the corn harvest, which she could not have done alone before the stalks rotted entirely. The work was hard and close and physical, and by the end of the first day, they were both covered in dust and chaff and moving in the easy, coordinated way of people who had learned how the other person moved. And the dangerous accumulation in Dorothy's chest had grown large enough that she could feel it pressing against her ribs when he stood close to her. On the second evening of those 2 days, when the corn was in and the children were asleep and the October dark was coming down over the flatlands like a curtain, they sat on the porch steps together, not quite touching, observing a careful propriety, and the stars came out over the Texas Panhandle in their thousands, cold and brilliant and absolute. "Can I ask you something?" Dorothy said. "You can ask," he said. "I may not answer." She appreciated the honesty of that, even if she wasn't sure how to take it. "What are you running from?" The pause this time was longer. Longer than any of the others, long enough that a coyote called somewhere out in the dark, and the Appaloosa shifted in the paddock, and a board on the porch creaked as Bernard shifted his weight. "What makes you think I'm running from something?" he said. "Because you move like a man who is," she said. "Because you came from the west, across the open country rather than by the road. Because every time I ask where you're going, you give me a direction rather than a destination." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I am trying to sort out a situation." "What kind of situation?" "The kind that will be resolved or it won't," he said, "and I will know which before the end of the year." Dorothy looked at him. In the starlight his profile was clean and still, and there was that quality in him again, that held, watchful stillness, like a man measuring every step before he took it. "Are you in danger?" she asked. "Not immediately," he said. "Are you a danger to my children?" He turned to look at her then, and the directness of his gaze in the dark was something she felt physically. "No," he said, and the word was flat and absolute, and she believed it completely and without reservation, which perhaps told her more about the state of her heart than anything else could have. "Then tell me when you know," she said, "about the situation." "Dorothy," he said, and it was the first time he had said her name, just her first name, without the ma'am or the careful formality, and the sound of it in his voice was something she was going to be thinking about for a very long time. "I don't want to bring something complicated into your life." "My life is already complicated," she said. "I am a widow with 2 children and $60 of debt on 40 acres of dry land. Simple left some time ago." Something that might have been a smile crossed his face, brief and quiet but real. "Fair enough," he said. She wanted to ask more. She did not. She had a sense that pushing too hard would break something fragile, and whatever this was between them, fragile and unspoken and freighted with things she did not yet understand, she was not ready for it to break. He left the next morning. He was back within the week. By November, the visits had a rhythm to them. He came every 6 to 8 days, sometimes from one direction and sometimes from another, always with something useful, a length of rope, a box of rifle ammunition, once a small mechanical part for the hand pump that Dorothy had been nursing along with prayer and improvisation for 3 months. He worked, he ate at her table, he talked with her children. He sat on the porch or at the table with Dorothy in the evenings and they talked about books, about the land, about history, about small things and large things. And then he slept in the barn and left in the morning. It was, Dorothy acknowledged to herself in the honesty of the small hours, the most she had felt seen by another person since Robert died. Robert had loved her in his steady, practical way, but Robert had not been deeply curious about her. Bernard was curious about everything, about what she thought, about what she'd read, about what she'd dreamed of doing before the practicalities of life had narrowed the field, and he listened to her answers with the full, focused attention that was his particular quality, and she found over time that she had been starving for that without knowing it. She also found over time that she knew almost nothing about his actual life. She knew small things. She knew he could fix almost anything mechanical. She knew he had read widely and thought carefully about what he'd read. She knew he had been to California and to New Mexico and to Kansas City and once, briefly, to Mexico, though he didn't say more about that. She knew he was careful with money in the way of someone who had not always had it. She knew he had a temper he kept tightly controlled, and she knew this because of the one afternoon when 2 men she did not recognize rode onto her property demanding to see the man who rides the Appaloosa. And Bernard came out of the barn with his face perfectly still and his voice perfectly measured, and told them quietly that they were on a woman's land and they would leave her property immediately. And the quality of the stillness in him in that moment was not mild at all. It was the stillness of something with a great deal of force held very carefully in check. The men left. Bernard did not explain who they were. Dorothy did not ask, because she was afraid of the answer, and she was not yet ready to be afraid of him. It was a week after this incident that Elias Horne rode up to her house. Horne owned the largest cattle operation in the area, the Triple H Ranch that spread across several thousand acres northeast of Dorothy's property. He was a widower himself, practical and prosperous, and he had, in the months since Robert's death, made it quietly clear to Dorothy that he considered himself a suitable candidate for her consideration when she was ready to consider such things. Dorothy had been neither encouraging nor discouraging. She had been busy surviving. He arrived on a Wednesday morning while Dorothy was hanging laundry, and he stood by his horse and talked to her about various county matters, a new water rights dispute, a rumor about the railroad, and eventually, with the careful indirection of a man who knows he is approaching difficult terrain, he said, "I've been meaning to ask you about your visitor." Dorothy continued hanging laundry. "Which visitor is that?" "The man with the gray Appaloosa," Horne said. "Bernard Ralston." Dorothy paused. "You know him?" "I know of him," Horne said, "and I've been watching him come and go from your place for the past month, and I'm not sure you know what I know." Dorothy set down a shirt and turned to face him. "Then tell me." Horne took a breath. He was not an unkind man, she had always believed that, but there was something in his expression now that she couldn't quite read, something that was concern and something else braided together. "Bernard Ralston is wanted by the federal marshals," he said, "for robbery. A series of train and stage robberies that happened between 1879 and 1881, starting in Kansas and running down through Oklahoma and into Texas. He was part of an outfit called the Ralston Gang. Yes, his own name, which tells you something about the arrogance involved, along with his brother and 2 other men." Dorothy felt the blood leave her face. 3 of the 4 men were caught in '81, Horne continued. The brother took a deal and testified. The other two are serving time in the federal prison at Fort Leavenworth. Bernard Ralston, the ringleader, the man who planned the operations, was never caught. He has been at large since 1881. There are outstanding warrants from Kansas, from Oklahoma Territory, and from the state of Texas. I received the notice through the marshal's office in Carver Creek less than 3 weeks ago. Dorothy stood very still with a damp shirt in her hands and let all of this settle over her like cold water. "You are certain it is the same man?" she asked. "The notice has a physical description that matches him precisely," Horne said. "Scar above the left eyebrow, gray Appaloosa." She looked past him at the paddock. The horse was standing there in the morning light, beautiful and incriminating. "I see," she said. "Dorothy," Horne said, and his voice shifted into something more personal, more direct. "I understand he has been helpful to you. I understand it is difficult out here alone. But this man is a criminal and he has been deceiving you and the danger you and your children are in. I appreciate you telling me," Dorothy said. Her voice was entirely controlled, which surprised her. "Thank you for coming." Horne blinked. "That's all you have to say?" "I need some time to think," she said, which was true. She needed a great deal of time to think, and she needed Elias Horne to not be standing in her yard while she did it. He left, eventually, after making it clear that he was available if she needed anything, and that she would be making a serious mistake if she continued to associate with Bernard Ralston. He also made it clear, though he managed it with enough subtlety that he could deny the implication if pressed, that a woman in her position might do well to consider a more reliable kind of protection. Dorothy waited until his horse was well down the road. Then she went to the paddock fence and stood looking at the gray Appaloosa, who regarded her with the large, liquid calm of a horse that has no idea he is at the center of a crisis. "You are a very expensive complication," she told him. He blinked slowly. She thought about Bernard's pauses when she asked about his past. She thought about the men who had ridden onto her property asking for the man with the Appaloosa, and the quality of his stillness when he'd faced them down. She thought about the way he'd moved across the open country when he first came to her, avoiding the road. She thought about his careful descriptions of direction without destination. She thought about everything that had accumulated in his silences, all the negative space in the portrait she'd been building of him for 2 months. And she thought about the way he sat with her children, the way he'd explained the breathing earth to Thomas, the way he looked at Clara when she was reading, the way he said Dorothy's name in the dark. Once, just once, with a quality in it that she had believed in completely. She thought about believing in something that might be built on a lie. She was still standing at the paddock fence when she heard the sound of hooves on the road and turned to see Bernard coming in from the east. He reined the Appaloosa up when he saw her face. He looked at her for a long moment, and then he looked down the road in the direction Horne had gone, and then he looked back at her, and the watchfulness in his face had changed into something else, something that was not quite resignation but was in that neighborhood. "Someone told you," he said. "Yes," she said. He dismounted. He led the horse to the fence and tied him and then turned to face her, and the quality of the stillness was there again, but this time it was not held force. It was something more like the stillness of a man who has been waiting for something and it has finally arrived. "How much?" he asked. 3 states, she said. "Federal warrants. Your brother testified." Something crossed his face at the word brother, a quick, deep pain immediately controlled. "Yes," he said. "Is it true?" she asked. "The robberies," a long pause. He looked at her with those dark, direct eyes and she looked back and she thought, "I need the truth now. Whatever it is, I need it." "Yes," he said. The word was quiet and absolute. No deflection, no justification, just the fact of it laid down between them. Dorothy had been bracing herself to feel the ground fall out from under her, and she found instead that she felt strangely calm, the calm of someone who has been expecting a blow and when it comes, finds it does not destroy them. "Tell me," she said. "Tell me all of it." He looked at her for another moment. Then he said, "Let me put the horse up first." She let him. She put the kettle on and sat at the table and waited, and the children were at the schoolhouse in town. Clara had been going 3 times a week since fall, and the house was very quiet. He came in and sat down across from her. He put his hat on the table and his hands on the hat and looked at her, and then he told her. He had been 22 when it started. His brother Daniel was 19, and they were both in Kansas City with no work and no prospects in the aftermath of the economic depression that had ground down ordinary men throughout the 1870s. They'd met a man called Hector Walsh, who was older and smarter and very persuasive about the mathematics of risk and reward, and who had a detailed plan for how to relieve the Kansas Pacific Railroad of several $1,000s in payroll money. "I knew it was wrong," Bernard said. "I'm not going to tell you I didn't know. I knew." They did 3 jobs in Kansas over a period of 18 months, careful, precisely planned, no shots fired. Walsh had a rule about that: no shooting unless someone shot at them first. Nobody was hurt in any of the Kansas jobs. The mathematics of risk and reward appeared to be working exactly as advertised. Then Walsh recruited 2 more men, and they moved into Oklahoma territory, and the dynamics changed. One of the new men was reckless, and the rule about shooting began to erode, and Bernard began to understand that he was in a situation that was going to end badly, and that getting out of it was not as simple as deciding to go. "By the time we came into Texas, I was already trying to find a way clear," he said. "The last job, a stage outside of Wichita Falls, I told Walsh I was done. He told me that was not an option. The stage job went wrong." A marshal riding as an unannounced passenger drew down on Walsh and a firefight started, and in the chaos, Bernard separated from the others and ran. He had not fired at anyone. He had not harmed anyone. But he had been there, and the robbery had happened, and the law made no fine distinctions. Walsh and the 2 newer men were caught 6 weeks later. Daniel, Bernard's brother, was caught separately, and chose to cooperate with the federal prosecutor in exchange for a reduced sentence. He gave them everything, including Bernard's role as the organizer. "Were you the organizer?" Dorothy asked. "Of the Kansas jobs, yes," he said. "After Walsh took over, I was one of 4. But Daniel's testimony made me the architect of all of it, which was not accurate, but which was also not a lie I was in any position to refute while I was running." The anger and the grief in his voice when he spoke about Daniel were equal and intertwined, and Dorothy looked at his hands on the table, large, work-roughened hands that had fixed her fence and her mule and her broken pump, and thought about all the things a person could be at once. "What are you trying to do now?" she asked. "You said you were trying to sort a situation." He straightened. Something shifted in his expression, something that was close to hope but guarded. "There is a federal lawyer in Austin," he said. "A man who handles cases involving excessive charges and prosecutorial misconduct. I have been corresponding with him through an intermediary. I am trying to build a documented account of what actually happened, what my actual role was versus what Daniel testified to, with the aim of negotiating a surrender and reduced charges." Dorothy stared at him. "You are trying to turn yourself in." "I am trying to turn myself in under circumstances that do not result in 20 years at Leavenworth for crimes I did not commit," he said. "There is a difference. How long has this been happening? The correspondence started 8 months ago. The lawyer believes we have a viable case, but assembling the evidence takes time. There are witnesses who need to be located, records that need to be obtained." He paused. "I expect to have an answer within the next 6 weeks." Dorothy was quiet for a long time. Outside the kitchen window, the November wind moved through the dry grass, and the Appaloosa shifted in the paddock, and the world went about its business with the indifference it always showed toward human complexity. "You should have told me," she said. "I know," he said. "You sat at my table and you talked to my children and she stopped. You let me trust you without giving me the information I needed to make that choice freely." "I know," he said again, and the way he said it, without defense, without the instinct to minimize, was almost harder to take than if he'd argued. "I am angry at you," she said. "I know that too," he said. "I am angry at you," she said again, And I am also, she stopped again, pressed her hand flat on the table. I need you to understand something. I have 2 children, and their safety and their stability and the continuation of their lives on this land is the first and only priority I have. It overrides everything else. Do you understand that? Yes, he said. If the lawyers and the marshals and the courts resolve this in your favor, if you can come back to this county as a free man, then we can talk about what this is and what it might be. She gestured between them. But I cannot. She stopped a third time, and this time the emotion in her voice was not anger. I cannot let myself fall further into something that may end with you in a federal prison, because that would break my children's hearts, and it is already going to do something to mine. The silence that followed was the most significant silence they had shared. Bernard looked at her across the table with an expression that was open in a way she had not seen before, unguarded. The held stillness released into something raw and real. "Dorothy," he said. "Do not," she said. "Not now, not until it is settled." He nodded. He picked up his hat. "One more thing," she said. "Horne told me you were dangerous, that the last man who trusted you ended up dead." Bernard was still for a moment. Then, "Hector Walsh is in Leavenworth and is alive." "I do not know who Horne is describing." "I believe you," she said. And she did, which might have been foolish, but she had staked her life on more uncertain ground before. He left. She stood at the window and watched him go, and then sat down very carefully at the table, and allowed herself exactly 5 minutes to feel the full weight of everything she was feeling. The anger and the fear and the tenderness and the complicated, inconvenient, entirely undeniable love that had been building in her chest for 2 months. And then she stood up and went to get the children from the schoolhouse. The next 3 weeks were the longest of her life. She thought about him constantly and refused to show it. She went about the business of her property, the corn was in, the winter preparations to make, the debt at the general store to manage, with the focused determination that had carried her through the 11 months since Robert died. She answered Horne's concerned inquiries with noncommittal politeness. She told Clara and Thomas that Mr. Ralston was away for a while, and they accepted this with the uncritical faith of children and went back to their respective occupations. She thought about what Horne had told her and what Bernard had told her and the difference between them, and she thought about betrayal, real betrayal, the kind that is done with full knowledge and full intention, versus the kind that is done by a man who has made a serious mistake at 22 and has been paying for it ever since. She thought about his hands on the fence posts and the way he'd talked to Thomas about the breathing earth. She thought about a lot of things. Horne came by twice more. On the second visit, he was more direct, and she understood that the something else she had sensed beneath his concern was, in fact, an offer, not a romantic offer, not precisely, but an offer of protection and resources and stability in exchange for something he left unnamed but clear enough. She declined, with more warmth than she felt, because she had no interest in being unkind and considerable interest in maintaining her independence. After Horne left, she stood on the porch and looked out at the empty paddock. She had asked Bernard to take the Appaloosa with him when he left, because the horse was both too recognizable and too valuable to leave. And she thought about what it meant that the absence of the horse felt like the absence of him, and whether that was something she should be ashamed of or whether it was simply an honest fact about the state of her heart. On the 18th day after he left, a letter arrived for her through the general store in Carver Creek. It had been routed through 2 intermediaries, which was careful and which she appreciated. It was from Bernard. It was brief, 3 paragraphs. He told her the case was proceeding. He told her the federal lawyer's name was Arthur Grenville, and that Grenville had been in contact with the U.S. Marshal's office in Austin about the terms of a potential arrangement. He told her that Grenville believed the excessive charges could be reduced significantly, that the actual provable crimes amounted to participating in 2 robberies, neither of which had resulted in injury, and that a guilty plea with cooperation could result in a sentence of 18 months or possibly less. The 3rd paragraph said, "I think about you and your children every day. I am trying to resolve this as quickly as I can, not because I deserve to, but because I want to." Dorothy read that last paragraph 4 times. Then she folded the letter and put it in the drawer where she kept Robert's letters from before they were married, which was the safest and most honest place she could think of to put it, and she went and made supper. She wrote back through the same intermediary route, a brief note of her own. "I am waiting. Be careful. Thomas asks about the horse." That last line was true. Thomas had asked about the horse 3 times. On the 7th day of December, 1882, a cold, bright Thursday with a sky like hammered tin, Bernard Ralston rode up to her house on the gray Appaloosa, and the quality of his arrival was different from every other time she had watched him come down that road. He was not arriving between other places. He was arriving. He dismounted, and he was wearing different clothes. Not his traveling clothes, but a clean shirt and a decent coat, and he had gotten a haircut, and there was something in the way he stood at her gate that was stripped of the usual watchfulness, like he had put down something heavy. Dorothy stood in the doorway and looked at him, and she had the sensation of her heart doing something large and uncontrolled in her chest. "It is done," he said. She stepped out onto the porch. "Tell me." "I surrendered to the U.S. Marshal's office in Austin on the 28th of November, he said. "Grenville had arranged the terms in advance. I pled guilty to 2 counts of conspiracy to commit robbery and 1 count of participating in the theft of mail, which was the technical charge for the stage job. In exchange for my full cooperation and testimony regarding Walsh's organization, the more serious charges were dropped. The sentence was 18 months in the county facility at Austin, which was immediately commuted to time served, with 3 years of supervised parole, because of the 9 months I spent assembling the evidence for Grenville's case." He paused. "I am a free man, Dorothy, under the law. I am a free man on parole, which means I must check in with the county authorities each month, and I cannot leave the state, but I am not wanted, I am not running, and there is no warrant for my arrest." Dorothy sat down on the porch steps, not because she intended to, but because her legs made the decision for her. Bernard came through the gate and crouched down in front of her so they were at eye level. "I should have told you from the beginning," he said. "The part where I did not tell you, I have been trying to find a way to explain it that does not make me seem like I was just protecting myself. But I think, honestly, some of it was protecting myself, and you deserve to know that." "Some of it," she said. "Some of it was also that I did not expect to stay," he said. "When I first came to your property, I was passing through. I was going to water the horse and keep moving. And then you were standing in your field doing the arithmetic on a situation that had no good solutions. And he stopped." He looked at her with an expression that was direct and unguarded and slightly bewildered, as though he himself was not entirely certain how he had arrived here. "I am not good at explaining things that happen to me without my permission," he said. Dorothy looked at him. "Things that happen without your permission," she said. "Like caring about someone," he said. "I did not plan it. I did not want to complicate your life. I have been trying very hard for several months to manage the caring and the complicating and the various practical circumstances simultaneously, and I have not always done it well." "No," she agreed. "You have not always done it well. I know." "But you fixed the mule," she said. Something happened in his expression, a quick, startled shift, and then what was unmistakably a smile, real and unguarded, the first complete smile she had seen from him, and it changed his entire face. "I did fix the mule," he said, "and the fence posts, and the fence posts, and the pump," she said. "The pump required 3 separate attempts," he said. "I am not sure that one counts." "It counts," she said. "It is working." She looked at him, this difficult, careful, complicated man crouching in her yard with his hat in his hands and his past resolved and his future uncertain, and his dark eyes full of something that she recognized because she had been carrying the same thing for months. "I have 2 children," she said. "I know," he said, "and 40 acres of land that I intend to keep." "Good," he said. "And $60 of debt at the general store, though it is closer to 40 now because I have been paying it down." "Also good," he said. "And I am not a simple woman," she said. I have opinions and I read books and I have been managing this property alone for over a year, and I am not going to stop having opinions or managing things simply because, Dorothy, he said. She stopped. I know, he said. All of it, I know. She looked at him for one more long moment. Then she said, there are conditions. Name them, he said immediately. You are honest with me, all the way honest. No more selective omissions. Yes, he said. You are good to my children. Which I do not actually think I need to say, but I am saying it. I know, he said. Yes. And you stay, she said, and her voice was level and direct, and she held his gaze without flinching. If you decide to be here, you stay. My children have lost one person who was supposed to be permanent. I will not have them lose another. The expression on his face was something she would think about for the rest of her life, the weight of it, the recognition of what she was asking, and the absolute seriousness with which he received it. I will stay, he said. That is not a condition, Dorothy. That is what I want. The winter wind came across the flat country and moved through the dry grass, and the gray Appaloosa stamped his foot in the paddock, and somewhere inside the house, Thomas began shouting about something with the volume and energy of a small boy who has just discovered whatever it is Thomas was perpetually discovering. Dorothy reached out and put her hand over his, where he held his hat in the yard. She felt his hand turn under hers and hold it, and the warmth of that, the plain, real warmth of another human being holding her hand with intention, in the December cold of the Texas Panhandle, was so immediate and so necessary that she understood clearly for the first time how cold she had been. Come inside, she said. I will put the kettle on. He stood and she stood, and they went inside together. Thomas appeared from the back room like a very small, very loud weather event and stopped dead when he saw Bernard, and his face went through approximately 6 different expressions in 2 seconds before landing on pure joy. You are back, Thomas announced. I am back, Bernard said. Is the horse here? Thomas demanded. He is in the paddock, Bernard said. Thomas was past them and out the door before another word could be spoken. Dorothy watched him go with the expression of a mother who has entirely stopped being surprised by Thomas. Clara appeared in the kitchen doorway with a book in her hand and took in the scene with considerably more composure than her brother, which was Clara's way. Hello, Mr. Ralston, she said. Hello, Clara, he said. What are you reading? She held up the book. It was a natural history of the American West that Dorothy had found at the general store and given her for her birthday. It says there are 400 kinds of birds in Texas, Clara said. I have seen 11. I am keeping a list. Which 11? He asked. And Clara told him with the focused precision of a child who makes lists seriously, and Bernard listened with his full attention, and Dorothy put the kettle on and looked at the 3 of them, the man and the 2 children in her kitchen on a December afternoon, and felt something settle in her chest that had been unstable for a very long time. Horne came by the following week. He came to the door with the expression of a man who has received unwelcome news and is not certain how to respond to it, and Dorothy invited him in for coffee because she was not cruel and because the resolution of things ought to be done properly. He asked about Bernard. She told him the situation, the lawyer, the surrender, the plea arrangement, the parole. She was direct and factual, and she watched him recalibrate as she spoke. The man who ended up dead, she said. You told me the last man who trusted him ended up dead. Horne was quiet for a moment. I may have overstated that particular point, he said, with the slight discomfort of a man who has been caught in an exaggeration and knows it. What I was told was that a former associate of Ralston's had come to a bad end. I passed it on without he stopped, without sufficient verification. I see, Dorothy said. Dorothy, he said, I was genuinely concerned for your safety. I know you were, she said. Some of it was genuine concern, and I appreciate that part. He understood, from the way she said it, that she had seen the other parts too, and he had the grace to accept that with something like dignity. He left shortly after, and he was polite when he came across them at the general store in the months that followed, and whatever he had hoped for, he let it go cleanly, which Dorothy respected him for. December became January, and January became February, and Bernard did not leave. He had, with Dorothy's agreement, taken up residence in the barn until such time as circumstances made a different arrangement proper. He made repairs to the property that winter that would have cost her weeks of labor and money she didn't have. He found work with a neighboring cattle outfit 3 days a week, which gave them income that made a material difference to the arithmetic Dorothy had been fighting since Robert died. He checked in with the county authorities in Carver Creek each month, punctually and without incident, and the county authority, a deputy sheriff named Graves who was a large, stolid, fair-minded man, treated him with the neutral respect due a man meeting his obligations. The debt at the general store was paid off entirely by the end of February. Dorothy felt the relief of that like a physical thing, like setting down a weight she had been carrying so long she had stopped noticing its presence until it was gone. On the evening of the day she paid the last of it, she told Bernard, and he looked at her with an expression that was warm and knowing and a little complicated, because he knew what that debt had meant to her, what it had represented in terms of vulnerability and precariousness, and she had not needed to explain any of that to him, which was, she had decided, one of the most valuable things about him. "What next?" he asked. "The south field," she said. "If I can get a proper crop in this spring, and if the weather holds, I can get ahead of things for once instead of behind. I can help with the planting," he said, "and if there's enough of a yield, have you thought about putting in a larger kitchen garden? The soil on the east side of the house looks good, deeper moisture retention than the main field." She had, in fact, thought exactly this but had not had the resources to act on it. "I had thought about it," she said. "We could fence it properly," he said. "Solve the rabbit problem permanently." She looked at him. "I suppose that would also solve the rabbit problem permanently," she agreed. And something about the way they were both talking, the easy, planning way, the way you talked about next spring and the following year and the year after that, was its own kind of statement about what this was and where it was going. In March, on a Sunday evening when the children were asleep and a late-season storm was moving through and the rain came down in silver curtains and the lamp on the table threw warm light across the room, Bernard sat across from Dorothy and said, "There is something I want to ask you." She set down the mending she was working on. She waited. "I am aware," he said carefully, "that there is a proper order to these things and that I am, by any reasonable measure, not a conventional candidate for the consideration I am about to raise." She felt the corner of her mouth curve upward, but she kept her voice level. "Go on," she said. "I am a man with a criminal record, a 3-year parole and limited material resources," he said, with the directness she had come to understand was simply his nature. "I have nothing to offer you in terms of social standing or financial security in any dramatic sense. What I can offer is honesty, which I should have offered from the beginning and did not, and the intention to work as hard as necessary for as long as necessary," and he paused, "and the fact that I love you, which I am aware is not a practical asset." Dorothy looked at him across the lamplit table, at this complicated, careful, honest man who had come out of the western country on a gray horse, and who had fixed her mule and her fence and her pump, and in the process had fixed something in her that she hadn't known was broken. "Bernard," she said. "Yes," he said. "Ask the question," she said. He took a breath. "Will you marry me?" The rain came down outside, and the lamp flickered in a draft from somewhere. And Dorothy Fletcher looked at Bernard Ralston for a long moment in which the whole complicated truth of the last 4 months was present, the secrets and the anger and the fear, and the tenderness and the long evenings on the porch and the way he talked to her children, and the letter that had come through 2 intermediaries, and the 30-second paragraph she had read 4 times, and all of it was fully present, and none of it was hidden. And she found that she did not need more time to decide. "Yes," she said, "I will." He let out a breath that was longer than any normal breath, a breath that had been held for months, and reached across the table and took both her hands in his, and the rain moved through the wide Texas dark outside, and the lamp burned warm, and Dorothy felt the ground beneath her unsteady for so long, for longer than she had let herself acknowledge, become solid at last. They were married in April, on a clear day with a high blue sky and a wind that smelled of new grass. The ceremony was performed by the county judge in Carver Creek, with Thomas in his best shirt attempting to be solemn, and Clara holding a bunch of wildflowers she had picked herself on the way to town with an air of tremendous ceremony. Graves, the deputy sheriff, stood as a witness, which was both practical and quietly meaningful, and a handful of neighboring farm wives, women who had watched Dorothy manage alone for over a year, and who had opinions about Bernard that had shifted considerably over the winter, came and brought food for the small celebration afterward. Horne sent a gift through the general store, a set of good kitchen implements, which Dorothy thanked him for sincerely, because it was a decent gesture, and she believed in acknowledging decent gestures. Bernard's parole check in that month fell on the day after the wedding, and he walked into the county deputy's office and stated his name and his current address, which was now Dorothy Ralston's homestead, 40 acres, Township Line Road, with a quality of plainness and solidity that was, Graves later told someone, the most settled he had looked since the whole business started. Spring became summer, and summer was good. The south field produced better than Dorothy had projected, and the kitchen garden on the east side of the house was properly fenced and planted, and became a running source of pleasure and minor drama, because Thomas had developed an intense personal rivalry with a particular ground squirrel who kept finding ways through the fence that Bernard had constructed with entirely genuine care and skill. And the ongoing tactical battle between Thomas and the squirrel became one of the defining narratives of that summer. Clara turned 9 in June and announced that she wanted to learn to ride, and Bernard spent 3 weeks teaching her on the gray Appaloosa with a patience and methodical care that made Dorothy watch from the fence with a fullness in her chest that never entirely diminished no matter how often she felt it. She told him she was expecting their child in late July. He was in the barn when she told him, patching a section of wall, and he went very still in the way she recognized, and then he set down the tools very carefully and turned to look at her, and the expression on his face was something she would describe to Clara years later, when Clara was old enough to ask, as the look of a man who has been given something he did not believe he deserved and does not know what to do with the enormity of it. "Are you well?" was the first thing he said. "I am perfectly well," she said. "Are you?" He stopped. "Are you glad?" "I am very glad," she said. He crossed the barn in 2 steps and held her, and she pressed her face against his chest and felt the steadiness of him, the particular warmth that was simply his, and thought, "This is what it is, then. This is what I waited for and worked for and very nearly let fear take from me." Their son was born in March of 1884, on a cold, clear night when the stars were out in their thousands over the Panhandle. They named him James Robert Ralston James for no particular reason, except that it suited him, and Robert for Dorothy's first husband, because Clara and Thomas had loved their father and the name deserved to be honored, and because Dorothy believed that honoring the dead did not require you to refuse the living. Bernard held the baby with the same careful, complete attention he brought to everything, and Thomas stood on his tiptoes to look over his stepfather's arm and announced with great authority that James had a very loud voice for a very small person, which was accurate. Clara made a list. It was of things James would need to learn. It was several pages long. The parole ended cleanly in January of 1886, 3 years to the month from when it began. The certificate of completion came through the county deputy's office, and Deputy Graves delivered it personally, which was, Dorothy thought, a generous thing to do, and she offered him supper and he stayed, and they ate around the big kitchen table, all of them, Clara at 12 and Thomas at 10 and James at nearly 2, climbing on Bernard with the confident certainty of a small person who is absolutely sure of where they belong. And it was a table full of noise and warmth, and the specific and irreplaceable quality of a family that has earned its way to each other. That evening, after the children were in bed and Graves had ridden home, Dorothy and Bernard sat on the porch in the January dark, wrapped in coats against the cold, the way they had begun sitting on porches together in October of 1882. "Free and clear," she said. "Free and clear," he said. "How does it feel?" He was quiet for a moment, in the way she knew well by now, not evasion, just the genuine consideration of a man who gave words their proper weight. "Like the ground is solid," he said. She leaned against him, and he put his arm around her, and they looked out at the flat, dark country under the winter stars, and Dorothy thought about where she had been 4 years ago, the debt and the limping mule and the arithmetic that always came out wrong, and where she was now. "I want to put another 20 acres in this spring," she said. "If we can get the fencing done before April." "We can get it done," he said. "Thomas is old enough to help with the post setting." "Thomas has been telling me so for 6 months, Bernard said. "He is not wrong," she said. "He is generally not wrong," Bernard agreed, and there was a warmth in his voice when he talked about Thomas that was one of the things she loved best about him. The way he had simply loved her children, without effort or performance from the beginning. She told him she was expecting again in March, when James was just past 2 years old. This time he did not ask if she was glad. He looked at her with those dark eyes full of something enormous and quiet and said simply, "Good." Their daughter was born in November of 1886, delivered by the midwife from Carver Creek in the middle of an unseasonable warm spell, and they named her Eleanor, which was the name of Bernard's mother. And when Dorothy suggested it, Bernard was quiet for a long moment and then said yes, with a voice that was careful and full. James approached Eleanor with the solemn scientific interest he brought to most things, which he had inherited from Clara. Thomas tried to teach her to wave at the horse through the window when she was 11 days old, which was, Dorothy thought, very much Thomas. The property had grown by then, 60 acres planted, the kitchen garden established and producing abundantly, a second mule, a small dairy cow, and the Appaloosa, who was aging gracefully and who had come to occupy a position in the family that was somewhere between working animal and institutional figure. Bernard had built a proper second bedroom onto the house in the summer of 1884, and a covered porch across the full front of the house in 1885, and they were comfortable in the way that matters most, not dramatically prosperous, but stable, with enough and more than enough, and the knowledge that more was coming. Elias Horne had sold his ranch in 1885 and moved east, and Dorothy had shaken his hand at the farewell gathering in town and wished him well and meant it, because she had room, now plenty of room, for generosity toward people who had once been complicated. On an evening in the spring of 1887, with 4 children in the house, Clara at 13, Thomas at 11, James at 3, and Eleanor at 6 months, Dorothy stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the south field where Bernard was working, with Thomas alongside him doing the post-setting he had been requesting the right to do for so long, and the evening light came across the flat land in long golden bars. And the gray Appaloosa stood at the paddock fence watching the work with the interested composure he brought to all events, and the kitchen smelled of the supper she was making, and from the back room she could hear Clara reading to James in the serious, careful voice she used for reading aloud. Bernard looked up from the field and saw her in the window. He raised one hand. She raised hers. It was a small gesture. It was also one of the larger things she had ever known. She thought about the day he had first come across the open country on that gray horse, avoiding the road, carrying his secrets and his past and his particular watchful stillness. She thought about his pauses when she asked questions, and about the men who had come to her gate, and about the letter that had come through 2 intermediaries. She thought about the morning Horne had stood in her yard and told her the truth about him, or the version of the truth Horne had, and about the afternoon Bernard had sat at her table and told her the fuller truth, without defense and without mitigation. She thought about betrayal, what it actually was and what it wasn't. She thought about the kind of secrets that are built on contempt for the person you are keeping them from, and the kind that are built on fear, and the difference between those things and why the difference mattered. She thought about a man who at 22 had made a serious mistake from which he had been trying to extract himself ever since, and who had spent 9 months of his life assembling the evidence to resolve it properly rather than simply running, and who had surrendered himself voluntarily to the law and taken the consequences. She thought about what trust actually meant, not the trust that requires someone to be perfect, but the trust that is offered to someone who has shown you who they are at their most honest, including the parts that are not easy. She thought about the gray Appaloosa standing at the fence, who had begun this whole story as a recognizable complication, and who was now simply a horse, aging in content and thoroughly at home. She turned back to the stove, and the kitchen filled with the smell of supper, and outside in the field Bernard and Thomas were setting the last fence post of the evening, and Clara's voice came through the wall reading to James, and Alina made a small sound from her basket in the corner that was not quite waking and not quite dreaming. Dorothy Fletcher, who had once stood in a cornfield in September doing arithmetic that always came out wrong, stirred the pot on the stove and heard the sound of her family, and felt the ground beneath her feet solid, earned, entirely real, and was, in the most complete and ordinary and extraordinary sense, home. The following morning was bright and clear, with a sky that went all the way to the horizon without interruption. Bernard was up before dawn, as was his habit, and Dorothy found him on the porch with his coffee when she came out, and they sat together in the early quiet before the children woke, and the Panhandle country lay out before them in the new light, flat and wide and full of possibility. "I have been thinking," he said. "Tell me," she said. "The land east of the property line, Hargrove's parcel. He has been talking about selling since last fall. If we could make an offer before spring planting, we could get another 40 acres at a reasonable price." Dorothy looked out at the land. 80 acres. She thought about the arithmetic of 80 acres, the planting, the labor, the yield, the future of it. "We would need help," she said. "Thomas will be 12 in June," he said. "And Clara has been asking about taking on more responsibility with the accounts." "She has," Dorothy agreed, because Clara had been asking about the accounts since she was 10, with the focused intensity of someone who has identified exactly what they are for. "And there is a boy in town, the Lester family's eldest, Jimmy, who is looking for steady work," Bernard said. "He is a hard worker. I have seen him at the cattle outfit." Dorothy was quiet for a moment, doing the arithmetic. This time it came out right. "Make the offer to Hargrove," she said. Bernard looked at her, and the expression on his face was the one she loved most, the one that was not quite a smile but was the thing a smile came from, the deep underlying warmth that had taken her months to fully see and that she now recognized as readily as she recognized the sound of her own children's voices. "I will go see him this morning," he said. "After breakfast," she said. "After breakfast," he agreed. She stood up and went inside to start it, and he sat on the porch for another moment with his coffee, looking out at the land that was his in the way that mattered not on any deed, but in every morning like this one, in the work of every day, in the children sleeping inside, and the woman in the kitchen and the old gray horse at the fence. And he thought about the series of decisions that had brought him here, the wrong ones and the right ones. And about the moment in a dry field in September of 1882, when he had looked at a woman standing among her corn, doing impossible arithmetic with her jaw set and her eyes clear, and had made, without knowing it was a decision, the best decision of his life. The Appaloosa nickered softly at the fence. Bernard raised his coffee cup in acknowledgement, which Thomas had once pointed out was not a normal thing to do to a horse, and which Bernard had continued to do anyway, because Thomas was right about most things but not quite everything. Inside the house, James woke with his customary lack of subtlety, and Clara called out something, and Thomas's feet hit the floor, and the morning began. Bernard set down his cup and went inside to his family.